In the meantime, the clock is ticking on this year's legislative session. We're already at the end of the first month, and lawmakers are only here until early June. So they've got to figure out what they're going to do this year, and fast. Republicans hold the minority in the legislature, but they're already out with a proposal that they say could help New Yorkers with the rising cost of inflation. For that and more, I spoke this week with Assembly Republican leader Will Barclay. Assembly Republican leader Will Barclay, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
Of course, anytime. So you have a new proposal out this week that you say could help New Yorkers with the rising cost of inflation. Of course, we've seen inflation go up nationwide at levels that we haven't seen here in decades. Your proposal, you say, would help consumers afford the higher cost of goods. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, to tell you the truth, it's sad to say, but I can remember back in the late 70s or early 80s when we had the same level of inflation. I think we have inflation at 7 or 8%. And with the effect it has on the middle class and lower middle class paychecks really is terrible. In fact, if you recall back in the 70s and the 80s, I think that's one of the reasons Reagan beat Carter was because of inflation. So a lot of people say, well, you can't do much on the state. And I disagree. We haven't heard a lot about it on the state. But one thing that we can do is take the sales tax off of items like gasoline, which inflation's affected something like 50%. Food items outside the home, they've increased 13%. And heating fuel is increasing like 30%. So if we can take the sales tax, that would provide immediate relief to New Yorkers. And we have the money now in New York to be able to do that.
Now, when you say food outside the home, are you talking about grocery stores, or are you talking about restaurants? What's included in that?
Well, it'd be restaurants, takeout food. Obviously, you don't pay sales tax on a lot of the items in the grocery store. So food that you would normally pay sales tax on.
Okay. So I can imagine, because sales tax is a big revenue raiser for local governments. So how would this impact them in terms of their budgeting? Could we see some shortfall there, or have you worked out the numbers and maybe it's not so much of a dent?
Well, we're talking about state sales tax, not local sales tax. So we'd only be talking about taking off the state sales tax. And according to our numbers, it would be about, I think, $2.6 billion. We're saying a 2-year suspension. So we're talking about $5 billion, a little over $5 billion, which would be the cost. But, as I said, budgetarily, as you know, you heard probably the governor's speech about we're doing pretty well from a budget standpoint in the state. And this is something we feel we agree with her when she's talking about doing middle class tax cuts and some other types of tax cuts, property tax cuts out into the future, but which is helpful, and we support those. But this is something we can do immediately to help New Yorkers who are struggling with inflation.
Okay. So, when we talk about efforts like this, we always come back to the property taxes in New York. And I think we talk about the exodus from New York all the time. We don't so much talk about the reasons why people are leaving, because I think there's a disagreement between a lot of people about why people are leaving. Is it the property taxes? Is it the income taxes? Some people say it's the weather, which, sure, I'm sure that some people do leave because of the weather. But let's talk about property taxes for a second, because I know that you've thought about this as somebody who is from upstate New York. How do you think the state could really reduce these property taxes for people, or at least keep them level? We've had the property tax cap. The governor's proposing the rebate. Do you think that goes far enough, or would you like to see things go farther?
Well, first of all, we got to stop mandating stuff on local governments. That's what's generating the cost, whether it's mandated on school districts or mandated on local governments. It's causing our property taxes to increase. You're right, we did put a cap on. I think that's a smart move. We capped the local share of Medicaid. That was the right move. One thing we could do is maybe take over the full share of Medicaid, and that would certainly provide a great relief to county governments. Then they wouldn't have to charge so much in property taxes. The other thing is school aid. The school aid formula, has always been a little inequitable. We're sending a lot of school aid to high wealth school districts versus low wealth school districts. I represent a lot of rural areas that don't have high property values, so they don't have anywhere to go when they have to raise money because they're mandated to do certain services and programs. So if we could provide those schools more money, they wouldn't have to rely on property taxes to try to, cover their shortfalls.
And I'm sure that issue is going to come up in the budget. And another issue that we're expecting to come up this year in some way, shape, or form is ethics reform in Albany after everything with former Governor Cuomo last year. And obviously, we've seen just decades of corruption at the state capitol. What do you think should be done here? Your conference has been really outspoken on ethics reform in the past, some at the level of just at the chamber level, but also at the statewide level. How can we clean up Albany? I know it's a big question, but give me
Right.
your brief argument
Well,
here.
I think the governor is right in one respect that J-COPE probably isn't the right vehicle to continue. As you know, it's been called jokingly J-joke. What I don't necessarily agree with the governor is she's suggesting, I guess, the deans of the law schools make up this ethics panel. I don't know what makes the deans qualified or why they would be, other than they have a legal background. So I would rather just see it if it was a true bipartisan um, organization. I think that's how they do it. They do that in other areas, and I think they've had better success in covering, any kind of misdeeds. I would mention this, Dan. One of the challenges we have with ethics, I once served on the Legislative Ethics Committee. I served on the Assembly Ethics Committee. We have the DA that has jurisdiction over us. We have the Board of Election that has DA. We have local DAs, and back home, and you have the U.S. Attorney. So there's a lot of bodies that could prosecute wrongdoing. Ultimately, the legislators have to understand, or anyone acting in government, that you don't do this to enrich yourself. You do it to try to make the state better and try to help your constituents and move things forward. And that message sometimes gets lost, I think, and we just have to keep pushing that. But ultimately, as we all know, there should be an oversight body. There should be someone that looks into ethics. And I think if it's done in a bipartisan manner, you'll get a more honest type of organization or body.
Your conference in the past has called for term limits for the speakership in the assembly. That hasn't happened. The assembly leadership, the Democrats, haven't agreed to that. I know that they don't want to do it. The governor's proposed term limits for statewide elected officials. So we're talking about governor, LG, controller, and AG. What do you think about that? Is that the right move?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it's going to have a hard time passing in the legislature. I think I heard the speaker already come out and say he doesn't support any type of term limits. But I do think there's something to it. I mean, we saw what happened with the last governor, who started off with a very promising administration. A lot of stuff, even as a Republican, I could get behind. But as he moved, I guess, consolidated power and moved further in his career, you saw him, I think, was taking more risk and really I think he felt a lot that he was above any kind of accountability. And so that's where term limits, I think, would play an important role, and certainly would have been important when it came to the last administration.
All right, well, we will see how it plays out. It's a really interesting proposal, and one that hasn't come up in recent years, certainly. So
Right.
we'll see. Assembly Republican Leader Will Barclay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Good talking to you.